Good evening, everybody, and I'm happy to see you again at the end of this conference that we've had those 3 days that we shared together, thinking and acting, performing together. I would like to thank you all for sharing this moment. And this was actually something we started in 2010 with Etienne Bolivar when he was here with us. Then we continued it with Foucault and then Beyond Capitalism, and now How to Act Together. We are doing it together with the Faculty for Media and Communication, and on this occasion I would like to thank with all my heart to Nada Popovic-Perisic, to Simona and Vanya, who are always there to support us. Again, I will just make a few introductory remarks into this seminar on the notes toward the performative theory of assembly. And I will start with a quotation. It's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Nothing less than those evils which threaten the whole species can disturb the calm sleep of the philosopher and force him from his bed. One man may with impunity murder another under his windows. He has nothing to do but clap his hands with his ears, argue a little with himself to hinder nature that struggles with him from identifying him with the unhappy sufferer. Savage man wants this admirable talent, and for want of wisdom and reason is always ready foolishly to obey the first whisper of humanity. In riots and street brawls, the populace flock together. The prudent man sneaks off. They are the drags of the people, the poor basket and barrel women that part the combatants and hinder gentle folks from cutting one another's throats. Rousseau's words from a discourse upon the origin and the foundation of inequality among mankind ring out forcefully and passionately in their political incorrectness. What mob, what rebel and barrel women could react more authentically than the prudent men in preventing the massacre? Who would even be the prudent men of our times? Would they not be those Judith Butler calls discursive strategists? It is not that the masses are less prone to violence, nor are they free of seeking conflict. Yet street clashes and fights remain confined to crime pages or dailies and obscure histories. They are larger, in fact blunted. In contrast, the epidemic of violent strategies aiming to suffocate struggles against inequality is on the rise. Its pathways and driving forces difficult to map out, pinpoint, and contain. We have here Judith Butler's notes towards the performative theory of assembly, published in early November by Harvard University Press. Today here in Belgrade, Judith Butler will speak about her book and the motives that drove her to take these notes on something we could call the performative theory of assembly. Sleeping uneasily, she has been on the road nearly 5 years, beginning around the time of the Tahrir Square events, having participated in Occupy Wall Street and the gatherings at Tukoti Park, but also in the West Bank, where she led a seminar at Birzeit University and visited a theater in Yenin, to Black Lives Matter and Gezi Park protests, noting reasons, posing questions and negotiating, putting up signposts and methods that could potentially describe or sketch out reasons that justified not only the purpose of public assembly that signifies resistance to inequality, and is this not Rousseau's motive, but also its place and function in society at large. Did you notice the interloper here? What is theory doing? What a philosopher? And how can we articulate something that Judith Butler here names the performativity of assembly? What is the context of creation of public assemblies? How are they put into action? How is the assembly of a people, of the 99%, formatized, realized, and executed? All words under the umbrella of the performative. Who are the people and how is their role expressed? Are we speaking the language of demos and democracy? What are modalities of public discourses and how is it the demarcation line of the people drawn? Before embarking on her argument and gradually expanding her premises, Butler writes, groups suddenly coming together in large numbers can be a source of hope as well as fear. And just as there are always good reasons to fear the dangers of mob actions, there are good grounds for discerning political potential in unpredictable assemblies. It is difficult to count the mob, yet it is extremely important to collect it, call it together, despite the various denominators of belonging, whether geographical or linguistic or others. Bring it together into infrastructures whose public use could guarantee equal rights of expression to all. The first chapters of this book focus on the distinction among kinds and forms of assembly that could carry a clear political content. Butler notes the disagreement between the political forms of democracy and the principle of popular sovereignty. Thus, Rousseau's first whispers of humanity can be detected in the bodies mobilized in spaces where exposed and laid open, they become clearly vulnerable and precarious. Hence, Butler writes, when bodies assemble on the street, in the square, or in other forms of public space, including virtual ones, they are exercising a plural and performative right to appear, one that asserts and instates the body in the midst of the political field and which, in its expressive and signifying function, delivers a bodily demand for a more livable set of economic, social, and political conditions no longer afflicted by induced forms of precarity. We might recognize such forms of togetherness as being in the state of becoming and potential forms of popular sovereignty. However, is any action of the people democracy in action? When squares, streets, devastated portions of cities, phantom neighborhoods, and occupied territories see the mobilization of the vulnerable and exposed, the precariously positioned that on so many occasions Jacques Derrida named à venir, démocratie à venir, then we can speak of forms of assembly that carry within themselves those fugitive moments of democracy. Yet, fugitive moments of democracy are not only transitory, since, in the words of Sheldon Wallen, democracy is not about where the political is located, but how it is experienced. Those who are seemingly whole and complete, male in charge, unquestionable, unique, and indivisible one, ought to recognize traces of vulnerability and precarity in themselves, thus allowing ethical ties to stand for ethnic or linguistic belonging and provide a common project against inequality. How can we act together in the first place when any such action fractures and breeds cruel apathy or rightness hysteria of the just, secure behind their wall of privacy, where the orchestration of reality TV occupies symbolic public squares and marketplaces? Butler, however, suggests, following Adorno, that it is not possible to lead a good life in a bad life, and that the imperative ought to be to lead a social life, implicating us in a large social, economic, and infrastructural world that exceeds our perspective and the situated first-person modality of ethical questioning. We have here indeed published notes not ready-made answers. Yet in moving towards a performative theory assembly, Butler is certainly not discouraged by the insufficient vulnerability of one's or the ignorance or precarity of the others. I will close my brief introduction by reading the last paragraph from the introduction of notes towards performative theory assembly. The constructive concern that groups of people assembling in large numbers could be both a source of hope as well as fear is really the paradoxical condition of action. Indeed, the very conception of human action as perversively conditioned implies that when we ask the basic ethical and political questions, how ought I to act, we implicitly reference the conditions of the world that make that act possible, or, as it is increasingly the case under conditions of precarity, that undermine the conditions of acting. What does it mean to act together when the conditions for acting together are devastated or falling away? Such an impasse can become the paradoxical condition of a form of social solidarity, both mournful and joyful, a gathering enacted by bodies under juruses or in the name of jurors, where the gathering itself signifies persistence and resistance. Again, many thanks for gathering here. Before Judy tells us a few words about the book, I kindly ask the participants of the seminar to give their comments and questions in the order we established. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much at the outset of this seminar to thank all of the people who have worked so hard, not only to put this wonderful conference together, but to make this visit so smooth and interesting and productive for me. So I really thank you all. If I might just say one thing, I left last night realizing that I had not answered Jania's question, which was about reason and feeling, male and female, and active and passive, how to think about those polarities. So if I might just take a moment and do that, I will feel better, and perhaps Jania, if you're there, maybe you will feel better. So I think one of the great contributions of feminist philosophy has been to call into question those polarities between reason, feeling, male, female, active, passive, and to show that they also tend to hierarchize the binary relation that they install. And of course we are always in a bind once we have shown that reason is understood to master feeling, or should master feeling, just as male should subordinate and master female, just as activity should subordinate passivity. We're always in a bind because the easiest strategy is simply to reverse the value given to the dyad and assert the superiority of the female feeling and the passive. Now, the problem with that is maybe obvious, but there are many so-called women who aren't going to like that particular identification, and it tends to still believe that there are these discrete and polar opposite differences between the sexes, rather than explore the complex continuum that gender is. And for me, writing this book on assembly, I think that I'm most interested in the, and maybe in the talk last night, I'm most interested in really rethinking the difference between passivity and activity in light of the problem. And it's a political problem. It's a very urgent and contemporary political problem. How and when do people take action, assemble, precisely under conditions in which they are undergoing something that they did not choose and which undermines their capacities to choose? So they're suffering. We might say there's a passive suffering of a condition that is not chosen, and yet there is an action that's not just my action or your action, but we're acting together now, right? We're coordinated. It's going to happen. You're helping me with my infrastructure. Thank you. So I think that one of the issues I'm trying to think about is how do we move beyond that polar opposite of the passive, the receptive, the responsive. Right? As soon as we get to passive, receptive, responsive is, well, is that passive? Is that active? Is that exactly both? Is that a term that defies the binary opposition itself? Responsive is already alive, animated, moving in the direction toward something else. It's not a passive standstill. It's not a pure being acted on. It's being acted on and being animated by virtue of being acted on in a certain way. And that being animated, which could lead us to all kinds of philosophical discussions, strikes me as between the active and the passive, or a different kind of configuration that moves us beyond the opposition itself. And I think that's also true about gender performativity. We could say it has conventionally masculine and feminine qualities. In other words, if I'm acted on by norms, but I am also acting, and at the same moment, then am I passive, am I active, or am I in what we can only call a linguistic and historical process that involves a different kind of combination? So I guess my view is not to transvaluate the binary, but to move us through it into other modalities that show us another kind of possibility outside of hierarchy and binary opposition. I think that's how I'm going to use my time. And that feels good. And I'm eager to hear from other people. I'm getting very tired of my own voice.
So Jelena Vasilievich will just start our action. Thank you. Thank you. It's such an honor and privilege to be here to speak. I'll be very concise and I'll go straight to the point, because I realize that we are we have to be strictly within our 5 minutes, and I'll also use this opportunity to remind other participants to do the same, so we really have only 5 minutes. And it's really difficult to start. Well, I find the book very, very engaging, and I couldn't restrain myself from embarking on different and mutually unrelated chains of thoughts and associations while reading different passages of it. And here I will try to single out only 3 themes for reflection and to establish some connections between them. First, vulnerability, of course. Well, there are some important passages about unequal distribution of precarity and vulnerability, but I couldn't help but think of an opposite process taking place today, which could be one of the reasons vulnerability became such a widespread notion and framework for thinking our present political and social conditions. And here I'm talking in general, not about the book. We noticed the ubiquity of vulnerability talk in today's academia. And this actually leads me to a pessimistic view
I think that we are overwhelmingly stressing the precarious conditions of our modern lives because of a certain randomness of precarity, I would call it, not the unequal distribution, the randomness of precarity, which hitherto hasn't been its defining feature, right? So certain equilibrium of the conditions generating vulnerability has collapsed with neoliberalism, and geographical and social distribution of vulnerability became less predictable. And we can already see the confusion this insight is creating. Just think of some of the reactions to paralysis after the recent attacks in Paris. You know, you could see that on online media, like, why don't you mourn Beirut bodies the same way you mourn for Paris bodies? And I don't even want to start digging deeper into this, because it's very complex, very polarizing, and certainly deserving of a much more serious approach. But the point is, we are moving towards becoming relatively equally vulnerable and exposed to uncertainties and failing structures, or at least previously reliable geographical and social containers of vulnerability are no longer at work. And that's why that is my pessimistic view. We are opposing vulnerability because it became so random, because all of a sudden we are all vulnerable. It's not just the poor or those living in the Middle East. We are all now vulnerable now. This is what I call the randomness of precarity. The second thing is already mentioned, infrastructure. Yeah, but here I want to stress that supportive functions of infrastructure is also something that we should understand in its totality, meaning that infrastructure supports inequalities and unequal distribution of vulnerability as well. And many passages in Butler's book indicate this non-pre-political nature of infrastructure, the way very conditions enabling political enactment are political themselves. So infrastructure is not unbiased, is not neutral. It does not only safeguard us against precarity, but simultaneously produces and reproduces precarious and vulnerable bodies, right? Because vulnerability stems from relationality, and this is very strongly emphasized in the book. And relations are constituted within socio-material contexts, call them cultures, societies, groups. And these contexts can only be played out through concrete infrastructures. And so finally, for me, the most important question is to somehow, I don't know how, but somehow to non-ambivalently connect and relate one to another. Infrastructure, livable life, and non-violence. And this is really the crucial question: what is livable life? It has to be saturated with norms, but whose norms? And it has to be supported by infrastructure that is supposed to be non-exclusive, even though it is political, and how, but is there political without exclusion? And at the very end, I want to ask a question which may seem totally non-related and non-topical, but I hope you'll see the chain of associations that brought me finally there. And the question is the life of an untouchable a livable life? The life of a Dali? Is the life of untouchable a livable life? And if not, by whose standards? And the example I took is not random, because the train of thought included the critique of Gandhi, and the figure of Gandhi is emblematic here because of his advocacy of non-violence as action, right? And you're probably, some of you, many of you are familiar with Arundhati Roy's criticism of Gandhi and the way she juxtaposes Gandhi to Ambedkar, another important Indian national figure who wanted to abolish the caste system. And Gandhi was very much opposed to Ambedkar, and one of the argument he put was, or we could translate it into terms of Judith Butler's book, perhaps not, is that abolition of castes would destroy the infrastructure of Indian society, and that would have violent effects. So in the name of preventing violence and preserving infrastructure, an argument could be devised to maintain one of the most violent systems of human relations this group has known. So it's kind of a question and a comment here on the line. Thank you.
To inform you that we agreed upon already that we are going to collect 3 to 4 interventions, and then we'll respond. So it's Eric's turn now. Thank you.
Delighted to have another chance to speak. And I'm very glad to have a chance to converse with Judy and Olive, and it's especially this interesting dispositif, which reminds me of the pictures of Tito that we saw on the way in and out. The Pietro atmosphere. So I'm confident that the final judgment will be favorable. To express my gratitude, I will be brief. There's a famous, ultra-famous scene in the French Revolution, the foundational scene, which is that of the National Assembly being trapped in the Jeu de Paume. And there's a famous sentence by Mirabeau saying, "Go tell your master, the king, who wants to disband this group, that we are here by the will of the people, and that we will be removed only at the point of bayonet." This foundational moment implies, it seems to me, a conflation of two definitions of espace public. One is the public sphere, that is representatives, the nation, and the other is an espace public, a public space. And my question is, in your work, how are the two conflated or distinct, and how useful can the distinction be? And I'll take the example of prostitution. The debates about prostitution in France have been very much, and I suspect not just in France, have been very much about the fact that we should sort of push them aside so that they're not visible. But this, meaning public space, also means they shouldn't have a voice, so public sphere. Now, if we think of what happened with the Islamic veil in France, in some ways it repeats this double exclusion. That is, we don't want to hear what they have to say on the one hand, and we don't want to see them in the public space as well. However, it has played differently because, for example, the girls who are not allowed in schools with their veil because they're public schools are allowed to put them on as soon as they leave the school, and therefore entering the real public space, which is outside the school. So I was wondering, is this distinction between the two meanings of espace public, the one that is more abstract, the public sphere, and the one that is more concrete and possibly bodily, people physically assembled, is this distinction of any use in your own work?
I thank the opportunity to join in this discussion, and especially thank you, Butler, for the thought-provoking text that we had a chance to read. I gather much before many of the readers had a chance.
Yeah, you're my first reader.
I think that's a rare opportunity. Following my colleague Jelena, I will resist the temptation to go into the many directions that your book opens as questions which I would otherwise love to discuss, such as gender or performativity or precarity. But I will focus on one thing that I noticed, especially in some of your work, say during the last decade or so. You engaged in conversations with Hannah Arendt. Now, following this trade, it is my impression that the tone of this book is for the most part resisting, I quote, or refusing Hannah Arendt. I dare say you're parting ways with Hannah Arendt? No, not yet. Okay. Well, in each particular argument that you said, I think resisting or refusing Arendt, you were quite right to do. So that all these arguments were very well put. However, I still think, and I'm glad I share this with you, that there are some possibilities in the way that Arendt's political theory may be further explored. And these possibilities are very much in the context of the questions that you did raise in the book. And the first concern that I would connect to this is actually the concern of responsibility, but as you very well put, wrestled from under neoliberalism and individualism. And again, pointing towards plural performativity, the emphasis on the plural, or acting in concert, or finally how to act together. And the other issue that I would like to connect to my question are some of the legitimate concerns of gaps, rifts, that you attempt to have to talk about a passage in order to overcome these rifts. The first one, very obvious concern of feminists and not only feminists, which follows from our stark division of the private and the public. And also, I'd like to concentrate on another, and that is a gap or a possible passage between thinking and acting. And in that context, my question concerns the possibility of using the Arendtian approach to judgment. As a possible link to bridging this concrete gap from thinking to acting, which Arendt undoubtedly left, I think. And in that sense, toward the end of your book, you did mention aesthetic judgment. And referring, of course, to Arendt's hopeful passage to the political. As we know, the structure of this model is, however, unfinished, which allows for different interpretations and perhaps different possibilities. And in that context, my question would be, if Arendt's concept of collective responsibility, which with her is already political responsibility, on which interpretation, on which possibility or possible interpretation of judgment can concerted action rely? Or perhaps not at all. And I think it dovetails, and finishing, dovetails to some of the issues that were already raised here in Athena Athanasiou's presentation, in Eric Fassin's presentation, the role of the intellectuals, the institutions, especially the academia, and so on.
Thank you, Dasha, very much. To encompass what has been said, I will just give floor to Jaja, who will just tell us more about the first chapter of the book. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and especially for the chance to be reflecting on something that has not been reflected. So in that sense, there is not an established reception of the work yet. So I really appreciate it. And I wanted to reflect mostly on the first chapter for two reasons. One is that I'm someone who deals with social linguistics, not sociolinguistics, to be exact. And I have translated a couple of works by Butler that deal with the concept of discourse into Hungarian. So I thought, like, this is the chapter which is kind of like one of the two new ones in the book that I haven't read before. And this is the chapter that brings me to my ongoing personal, if you wish, research interest about the validity of the category of identity. And therefore my question and concern is to address the differentiation that you draw between a politics of precarity as something that is more promising vis-a-vis an identity politics. So, first I would like to sum up like how I read your position, and then I would like to reflect on it and then develop the question to sort of like situate it as much as possible for everyone. So, I take that this is what you develop there as an argument. On occasions of collective occupation of public spaces by bodies that are deemed disposable, people come together to demand a livable life. They demand the very right to appear and thereby say, we are still here. So they don't have, on these occasions, if you wish,
a list of specific demands concerning a vision of how to make their life more just, if you wish, more livable, because I gathered that would run the risk of identity politics. Whereas precarity allows for a broader understanding of demand, and this broader demand is made possible paradoxically by the fact that precarity allows for sharing the demand of livable life in public spaces in the form of a political act of plural performativity. Now, my reflection starts precisely with how to understand this plurality. Okay? So, if we accept as an ontological premise that utterances are structured by plurality or multiplicity, that is, meaning of any category, including identity and precarity, this time, is polyvocal or dialogic in Bachtian sense of the word, then all categories are informed by this multiple logic, at least potentially. That's all should sort of like satisfy as an understanding. Then the question to me is not whether identity as a category should fail to furnish what it means to live together, because it will always exclude some groups, while precarity is able to include potentially anyone. I would rather say that what we are concerned with rather is the genealogy or the history of the formations of the categories themselves, i.e. whether the current conditions of social struggles are more favorable towards an understanding of precarity than identity, because identity inherently should be exclusionary. So maybe then precarity, both in academic and non-academic discourses, has not been sedimented in the same way as identity has been to evoke people as a group. And this is why we can invest in its political potential. And in a way, I'm asking you whether you agree with this kind of reading, and I'm asking you because I would say that in Bodies That Matter, you have got a chapter on how to be critically queer. And maybe I would say that identity then is not that much of a useful category now, because politically critical at the moment is more useful to imagine from within the framework of precarity and to try to negotiate what counts as livable life from within that framework, because precarity is just beginning to establish itself even within academic discourses, like within these reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. Zaza, Judith, should you just...
Yes, okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Jaja. I think maybe we had an email correspondence, is that correct? That I thought. First of all, Helena, I appreciated very much your remarks. They could, in fact, develop into enormously robust criticisms in time, so I hope you go on to read other books. I'm just kidding. Look, there are many important issues here. I take it that the pessimistic view that you're offering is one that suspects that, in fact, precarity has become increasingly random and that it affects people in increasingly random ways, ways that can't be patterned or predictable. and you suggest that perhaps we're not living in a situation of the unequal distribution of, actually I believe vulnerability was the term, but we actually are experiencing randomly induced vulnerability. So on that, I would just say this, that I think that there's a very interesting debate going on having to do with Thomas Piketty's work, suggesting that in fact we can chart and track accelerating inequalities at the economic level, and that wealth is being accumulated by fewer and fewer people at a greater rate, and poverty is being expanded at an accelerated rate and including more and more people. Now, one question is this: for those who might understand themselves as middle class, or who believed that going to school and getting a job would safeguard them from debt and precarity, they are finding that the jobs they're getting are temporary, or the debts that they are accruing cannot be paid off even with a full salary, right? So to be salaried is not enough to safeguard against the prospect of unpayable debt. And I don't want to be too economistic about it. I'm not really an economistic mind. But I do think the Piketty argument is an interesting one, because for that group who's trying to ascend to the middle class, or who understands itself as functioning within a middle class presumption, only to find that they lose this job, or this job doesn't work, or the salary isn't okay, or I can't get a house, or I can't do any of the things that were in the promise, that were part of the traditional promise of middle class employed life. That it does feel random. It can be registered as random. Why did I have this job and then suddenly I do not? Right? That's random. Why did I get this salary only to find that I can't pay the rent with this salary? That feels random. It is random at a certain level, because patterns that we expect to replicate are in fact breaking down. But it may be that those random patterns, those random acts, can be thought about in terms of Piketty's understanding of economic inequality as a registered effect, or an effect of randomness that actually belongs to this unfortunately patterned way in which economic inequality is increasing, in an unfortunately predictable, not totally predictable, but trackable.
Just one sentence.
Yes.
Is it okay? Just one sentence. I don't want to be misunderstood. It's important.
My pessimism was not about. I'm not pessimistic because I think that vulnerability is becoming random. I'm pessimistic because we are protesting vulnerability because we see it as random. And once when we saw vulnerability as being contained geographically and socially,
yes,
we're not protesting that. Now that it's random, no, it's not okay.
I see. Got it. But would we not protest it if we saw it as not only unequally distributed, but increasingly unequally distributed? In other words, I think there is an analysis that can produce perhaps a more well-informed protest. But thank you. I think that's really helpful to think about. I completely agree with you that infrastructure can support inequality. That was the problem with apartheid. It was the problem with slavery. It's the problem with the caste system, as you point out. And though I make use of Gandhi on occasion, I am not in any way committed to all of Gandhi's views. I don't accept his views on caste. I don't accept his views on women, or indeed on passivity. No. Okay. So if abolition of the caste system destroys the infrastructure, is that a bad thing? No, that strikes me as a revolution. And sometimes infrastructures do have to be destroyed or brought to a halt in order for something like revolution to take place. So maybe the category that I'm missing from this book is revolution. Okay. So, Eric, I appreciate very much your letting us imagine once again the Assemblée Nationale trapped in the Jus de Pomme. Really amazing. Of course, maybe we make three distinctions. Espace public, the public space, the space of appearance as defined by Hannah Arendt, and the space of politics as defined by Hannah Arendt. And it gets confusing because Arendt does have a distinction between the private and the public, and at least in the human condition, it would seem that it's the public sphere which is the presumptive space of politics. And yet, as she describes the space of politics, we realize that it is effectively disjoined from any particular architecture. It doesn't have to be the square. It doesn't have to be an established, a pre-established public space. It actually comes into being wherever and whenever a group of people gather together and act in concert. So that's the literal plural performativity of her view. We get together and act in concert, and we can be in the Jus de Pomme, or we can be, you know, in the railway station, or we can be on the street, or we could be any number of places. But in so far as we act together, we produce a space of politics which in my view, re-articulates the public in a new way, right? Outside of any established or recognizable espace public, public space. So that seems interesting. Of course, I love that idea of hers. It's beautiful. It's romantic. I wish it were true. But in fact, I worry about her transcendence of the material conditions of acting, the question of support, the question of architecture, and infrastructure. So that's where I try to maybe reground it, or at least point out that that action always needs support, right? All action needs support. So it doesn't have to be a recognized public space that is the support. I think that would be a kind of Bourdieu argument. But still, there must be some kind of structuring of space for that to take place. The question that you raised about prostitution is an interesting one. Should sex workers, which some of us would prefer to call them, remain invisible? Should they remain unrepresented, or should they be in fact visible, an acknowledged part of public life, and also represented by unions and institutions that will make sure that they work safely and with proper pensions? I'm in favor of that second view. I guess I wanted to point out that, at least in France, the question of what is permissible in the public space is confused. As you yourself pointed out with the wonderful example of the woman who leaves school without the niqab and then puts it on. And I saw in the État d'urgence, which was very interesting, they were interviewing the neighbors in Saint-Denis where the suicide bombing was, and where the arrest of those responsible for the attacks were living. And this woman was in a full face veil with a niqab, and she was giving an interview to the television show, and they just, they wanted her information. They weren't going to say, you can't appear like this on a public television show. they let her appear, and she had a perfectly interesting set of remarks to make about the people who were living and how much she didn't like them. But they did show it, and it caused a brief problem in public discourse. You know, should she not have been interviewed? Should that face not have been broadcast? Well, she was kind of a witness. She's a neighbor. She had things to say, and someone thought, let's forget about them. Let's hear what this woman has to say. So I enjoyed that little transgression. It seems to me there are many inconsistencies on how public spaces is regulated. Dasha, thank you for your remarks on Hannah Arendt. I really believe that your central question on what concept of judgment does concerted action rely is an excellent question. I don't have a clear answer to it, but I would be most interested in trying to think through Arendt's writings on reflective judgment and aesthetic judgment in Kant in relationship to concerted action. If we could put those different strains of Hannah Arendt together, it would be quite amazing. My worry has always been that the one who judges is a more or less spontaneous, free, sovereign, reasoning creature. And that's not a we, that's not a plural we who's exercising judgment, especially in the work she does on civil disobedience, or when she talks about moral responsibility under dictatorship, right? Then we really are holding individuals responsible for not simply saying, I refuse to follow the laws of the Nazi regime. They fail in matters of personal and individual judgment. But to think about judgment in relationship to plurality and to concerted action, I think she didn't do it. I think it's left to us to do it. Maybe Linda Zerilli has done it. She seems to be the person I know who has gone as far as possible in that way, and I would be willing to be led and illuminated. So thank you very much. Jaja, I don't know whether you were suggesting that one reason I prefer precarity over identity is that precarity allows me to think about livability, whereas identity would compel me to think about justice. Was that a point that you were making? Oh my. Well, I would certainly want to be able to talk about justice, but I guess what eludes me is why it is that identity would be linked to justice. I don't see the immediate. Maybe I'm missing something terribly obvious. It seems to me that there are all kinds of ways of asking for justice. We can ask for the just distribution of wealth. We can ask for legal justice in relationship to atrocities committed. We can ask for a just society in which laws and political organizations are open and transparent. I'm not sure how any of those particular versions of justice would rely on identity. And sometimes identity claims are about wanting to be recognized. I thought identity seems more linked to the question of recognition than to justice, but maybe there's a link there that I'm not seeing. But I would hope that I would be able to account for justice, as I would hope that I'd be able to account for judgment, although it's not what I do here. And that may well be a limitation of this book. I very much appreciate well, there are 2 points really, which is that all identity categories are multiply created and multiply determined, which means that they're not as identitarian as we might think. So I appreciate that very much. And I just, as we say in English, I take my hat off to you. That's a very good point. And then But your last speculation, perhaps the term precarity has not been sedimented in political discourse as much as identity, and in that sense, it's not yet fully determined, or not, or it provides more openness. Well, I think that Petar and some others are going to suggest that precarity is embedded, in fact, in forms of paternalism, which I'm going to wait to respond to. So let me say this simply, which is that the reason to think precarity, I mean, I'm not choosing precarity out of thin air. I'm noticing that there are mobilizations in and around precarity, and that this has been a term that I understand to be developed to supplement the idea of the proletariat. The proletariat is a group of exploited workers, and it seems to me that the precariat go in and out of work. They can't even necessarily be understood primarily as workers, because the status of the worker is not fully available, given the way in which employment has become temporary or contingent or retractable. So I'm trying to follow those mobilizations, and if that's not the word, that's okay. I don't think that it has to be one word around which people mobilize. I think there are numbers of, maybe I would say, a family resemblance of words that we might be able to collect and think about as mobilizing, as having a certain mobilizing force, or holding out an aspirational possibility. We'll come back to this once paternalism enters the scene.
Thank you. Definitely. So, starting the second round of our comments and questions, Peter will be the first, Katarina will be the second, and Brigitta the third. Thank you.
Okay, I'm very happy that we are talking about this text, and I would like to thank Judith Butler for being here and having written this book. And I hope that we will have the opportunity to publish this conversation, the transcripts of this exchange in Belgrade. The question from the chapter, Precarious Life and Ethics of Cohabitation, I quote, what is the relation between precarity and vulnerability, about which in yesterday's lecture Butler announces the continued search for a closer connection between these two words, but also Butler's awareness that there is I quote, the risk of using the term vulnerability. There is, of course, I quote, also an even more sinister way of wielding both categories of precarity and of vulnerability. Her various hesitations, etc., all center in Butler's project to gently modify Hannah Arendt, and I quote again, following Dasha, I quote Judith, I would suggest when vulnerability is itself mobilized not as an individual strategy but in concert, and to think vulnerability and agency together, or else to mobilize vulnerability in concert, as well as mobilizing precarity, I quote, to show us the simultaneity of being precarious and active. You'll remember from yesterday's lecture that the biggest problem, it seems to me, is constructed around paternalistic power. I quote Judith from yesterday. A most important criticism, says Butler, emerges from those who argue that vulnerability cannot be the basis for group identification without strengthening paternalistic power. This is followed by Butler's attempt to improvise a swift and effective response. My question is how it is possible a priori to cleanse vulnerability or precarity of paternalistic histories when they are its integrative part. Let me elaborate. The moment of resistance, apart from the group of or mobilizing precarity, necessarily implies the existence of a strong instance of sovereignty. This could be easily shown through a legal history of precariousness protocol, which sums up the entire political theology of the Western world and Christianity. The word precarity or précaire appears for the first time in the 16th century. For example, Levinas, I recall, uses the phrase ontological precarity somewhere, saying that the face or visage is precarity more precarious than all precarity. Précarité plus précaire que toute précarité. It comes, the word precarity, from Latin, legal jargon, precarius, and means obtained by praying, prax. Surprisingly, the origin is at once juridical and religious, or pseudo-religious. This etymology would indicate that all precarity is synonymous with dependence on a curatorial power, regardless of its precise nature, which could give us what we ask, or refuse our request, or even withdraw it from us at any moment after having given it. Whence the idea that anything precarious is poorly established and secure. However, this etymology also at once signals that human precarity is not exclusively a contemporary issue, nor indeed a recent one. By definition, there is a precarity wherever there is a power. To reiterate, precarity exists in a place where, 1, there is a power that can be solicited, asked, begged for something. Usually this is land or some such benefit. 2, or 2, something has been lent or borrowed without a contract. A transaction that is not a legal act, not an obligation, but a simple fact. And 3, it is not a lending or borrowing with a specific date of return, but the owner, that means sovereign instance, decides on their own when the precarious must return the land, for example. This is called precario. In Naples, 1772, Giambattista Vico writes in the margin of his book Il diritto universale about the precarium as the origin of the contract. 100 years prior, Hugo Grotius writes about Jews to whom the Roman emperor allowed the conduct of public ritual and the following of their own laws based on jus precarium and not on the laws of the empire, meaning that he could have abolished them whenever he so wished. It seems entirely clear to me then why Abraham insists to purchase the land on which to bury Sarah and not accept it as a gift, and why, on the other hand, the various 17th century converts who abandoned Judaism think that precarity is a sign of malediction. Conversely, a good example that could also be thematized is as follows. If the great legacy of the French Revolution was to make all work of limited duration in order to prevent the risk of slavery and servitude, since, as we know, there were no contracts of unlimited duration until the end of the 19th century, or if people have consciously accepted precarity as a common resistance to becoming individually subjugated, it is uncertain whether inequality is thus reduced or even if the master or sovereign is thus lessened, assuming that the goal of resistance is to bring more justice. Might we ask, does justice reduce vulnerability? Thank you. Thank you.
Minutes, and we were told to be between 3 and 5. I have to say more than 3 and a little bit less than 5 minutes. I cannot discuss all the important topics Judy Butler explored in her new book, but I must say that all of the issues are important to us today for our lives and our struggles against injustice and inequality we face with. First, as a feminist, I must say that this book is very important for feminism, because almost all the problems you discuss are problems that feminists explore, from subversion of the dichotomy between traditionally political and non-political sphere, over the analysis of the concept of the individual, to the relationship between I and we, and discussion of possibility of joint political action. However, in these couple of minutes, I would like to say something about the concept of vulnerability as one of the crucial concepts you analyze in the new book. It is a very important concept of feminism as well, and as you say in chapter 4, about the vulnerability and coalition politics, that feminist theorists have for a long time argued that women suffer social vulnerability disproportionately. You recognize in the book, and you said yesterday, something about the dangers of understanding that women have an unchanging and defining vulnerability, because it leads to asking a paternal authority for special protection, and at the very same time affirms that inequality of power that situates women in a powerless position. So I agree with you, what you say in the book and yesterday at the lecture, that vulnerability is not totally active or passive, and that vulnerability and resistance can and do happen at the same time. And we can see that, I think, in different feminist claims as well. So that was actually my brief comment from feminist perspective about the importance of the concept of vulnerability developed in the book, and its importance, I believe, for further feminist analysis. Now I'm going to use the opportunity that you're here today among us and to ask a question about something that is rather absent from the book, but it is close to you and your work. And I would like to hear your opinion about the concept of vulnerability presented in the theory of your colleague and friend, Racha Ettinger. Ettinger's work is not unknown here for the wider audience, because she was in Belgrade last year as a keynote speaker at the Summer School for Sexualities, Cultures and Politics, organized by our colleague Jelisaveta Blagojevic on behalf of the Center and Faculty of Media and Communications. The concept of vulnerability is one of the crucial concepts in your recent work, not only in your new book, as well as in Ettinger's work, and not only hers. I'm using her as an example of a rather different position. You're both inspired by and very critical about two authors you're dealing with in the new book, Arendt and Levinas. And you and Ettinger conceptualize vulnerability in a similar but at the same time different ways, in part due to different theoretical frameworks, but I believe that they can communicate with each other. For both of you, the body that is vulnerable is a crucial point. The body is always already vulnerable, and it is important to recognize the same vulnerability or potential for vulnerability of the other. And for both of you, interdependency is important, although you two do not use the same terminology when speak about interdependencies. But for both of the subject is never alone, never isolated, and always dependent on the others. I believe that the crucial point of disagreement between you and Ettinger is Ettinger's invitation to return to transsubjective recognition of subjectivization, and transsubjectivity for Ettinger is co-emergence of I and non-I. And the second point of disagreement is that while both of you speak about the vulnerability of the subject, of the body, Ettinger claims the recognition of the vulnerability of the others and self-fragilization as a chosen position. She believes that self-fragilization is the position upon which you can act because you have chosen to self-fragilize yourself in an encounter with the other. So from this point, it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, differences in yours and Ettinger's account of vulnerability can have different political consequences. And despite the fact that I think that your account of vulnerability is much closer to the account I would embrace. I'm asking you, if you can, to explain from your point of view differences between these accounts of vulnerability, and especially because you are reluctant to accept self-fragilization as a chosen position.
Okay, and I would really like to express my appreciation for giving me the opportunity to participate in this roundtable. Professor Butler, I'd like to actually ask you from the perspective of book, if you could comment on the events that we are witnessing or living now here in Europe, in the Balkans, the so-called refugee crisis, with a special reference to the Balkans. People arriving in Europe through now a very vibrant current Balkan route share the notion of precarity with those people mentioned often in your book, people, undocumented workers gathered in the streets, people from the Occupy movement and so on. But as well, they to a great extent share the fact of vulnerability. I'm not sure though whether it is possible to call their movements concerted in the same sense as, for example, a massing of undocumented workers or a massing on the Tahrir Square. Although those people move in accordance with one another, as well as with all the possible support they are able to get, sometimes not official, not legal, usually overtly criminal. Nevertheless, they take over and pass through different areas that in many ways become public or politicized in a different ways than before, when their bodies did not appear there. For example, the illegal crossings of green borders, pressure on opening soft ones, and on the other hand, barbed wires, building walls, etc. But they do not intend to occupy the streets or squares of Balkans in revolt because of such a declining state of matters. They actually want to pass through the Balkans, preferably as quickly as possible, in order to reach a different place where I suppose they believe their life could become a livable one, or even a good one, regardless of the fact that practice shows often the opposite. So my question is, would EGIDA acting together be applicable to the fact of the en masse arrival of people mostly from the Middle East to Europe crossing Balkans? Or is it some other form of acting, some form that belongs to a state of affairs that are maybe pre-political, or some other register of things that we do not yet have the language to describe? How then should the public claim of those people, which is comprised of being able to live a livable life in the countries that rarely and occasionally recognize Middle Eastern lives as livable, so how is that to be thought of? And connected to that, and this is basically the end of my three-part question, is the space or area of Balkan traditionally understood and treated as another of Europe possible as a space of concerted public action that can bring about a radical democratic change? For it seems to me that the name Balkan Route functions as a performative act that enacts, shapes, and situates assembled bodies aiming to traverse a specific space, as well as those destined to live in this very space, especially regarding the fact that insecurity over livability of Balkans' lives amounts to certainty over understanding the Balkans as a space that is always relevare continuare, how the poet from where I come from would put it, between the border lines.
So we just finished the second round of questions, and Judith, you can respond?
Yes. I'll try to be brief. These are, of course, all really excellent questions. And I find myself surprised and pleased by every question I receive in Belgrade. I don't know why that is. It's not that I had a different expectation. It's that I don't know, the form of engagement. It's extremely serious and thoughtful and respectful, and there's nothing formulaic about it. So I can't just occupy a role and that question again. You know, which is what I'm sometimes used to. Maybe I'm just visiting the wrong places. Okay. First of all, let's think a little bit about this extraordinary etymology of precarity that Peter has offered us. And I think there are at least two questions raised by the etymology. Is it possible to disjoin precarity, the paternalistic tradition from which it comes? And is it possible to disjoin precarity from the idea of an arbitrary sovereign, right, which is a very specific kind of paternalism? The figure of the arbitrary sovereign who decides when and where and whether the precarious must return the land. So what I want to suggest is that it's precisely this etymology that offers a certain kind of descriptive power. In other words, the term precarity offers, by virtue of this etymology, a descriptive power for certain kinds of relations that we experience in the present. And I think one could actually read this through the work of Giorgio Agamben in an interesting way, thinking about the precarious as bare life or as subject to sovereign expulsion or containment or both. But what interests me about the, many things interest me about the etymology you've provided, is that precarity exists where there's a power that has to be begged for something. In other words, those who are precarious are in the position of having, of living at the whim of a sovereign who is under no contractual obligation to engage the precarious in a just or fair way. It's an importantly, as you point out, it's an importantly pre-legal condition of dependency and petition. So why would such a term be brought forward to describe contemporary relations of labor and dispossession? Well, one reason is that labor contracts have become a thing of the past, that we're entering again into a situation where people are working without a contract, or long-term contracts are nullified, or short-term contracts have qualifications built into them that give the employer the possibility of ending the contract at will. So we've seen the destruction of labor unions and syndicalism in various parts of the world. And we also see the outsourcing of labor to countries where there is no regulation of labor practices or very little, so that labor can be exploited outside of recognizable contract and outside of the reach of international labor law. So it's that outsourcing of labor that has produced the contemporary situation of precarity. Now, you're right to point out that precarity is bound up with paternalism and with arbitrary sovereign power, but maybe what we are actually seeing is an entry of this idea of precarity into the contemporary world precisely precisely on the grounds that the idea of labor contracts that can be relied upon and employment that has that is contractually guaranteed to be long-term are falling out of favor, and we are now falling back into this pre-legal situation. Who are the arbitrary sovereigns of our contemporary scene? Well, they are corporations. They are sometimes universities that hire contingent faculty and abandon them before they have the chance to achieve security. That's becoming an increasing norm where I live. So it's a world of broken contracts and weakened or eviscerated labor unions and labor laws. The transnational labor practices are ones that can consistently break with internationally regulated labor laws, And maybe this is what reanimates such a term from the past. Now, when you say that the sovereign or the paternal is integrated into the very concept, I don't know. I mean, I think we can trace that etymology, and that gives us many illuminating insights, and we could even say that that etymology illuminates the descriptive power of precarity in the present to describe a contemporary situation for those who are in and out of labor. But to mobilize on the basis of it, that is to say, to identify as the precarious or to oppose the condition of precarity, is precisely to reanimate the concept by virtue of that etymology and against that etymology, right? I mean, we have anachronistic terms become animated for contemporary reasons, and they become redeployed for counter purposes, and the etymology can't constrain that. There's nothing about the etymology that can stop that redeployment or that reanimation from happening. I love etymologies, but I'm not that much of a Heideggerian that I think they finally control the semantic reach of the concept. Okay, anyway. It was Derridian, wasn't it? Okay. Bracha Ettinger, it is true, I've engaged her work in several essays, and she has engaged mine, and she is responsible for alerting me to the importance of impressionability, what she calls primary impressions. And for her, these are very often psychic traces that can't be thematically or consciously recuperated, but that leave their traces in the visual field in some way. I certainly have cited her before, and I've worked on her, and I have written essays in her exhibition catalogs. And if I didn't cite her in this book, then that's just an oversight, and I'll correct it in the next edition. I worry that the idea of the matrixial in Ettinger's work gives a kind of primacy to the figure of the mother. And I think that for me, I accept that there is this primary, radically non-volitional dependency, but I am not sure we can call the support system even for the infant, I'm not sure we can call that entire support system the maternal. Now, she might understand me as, as somehow having a rejection of the mother. I don't know. I think the mother plays a really big role, but I don't want to. I want the maternal to be the name for all enabling support. I mean, the truth is that infants are brought into the world under all kinds of conditions, and mothers are also supported, hopefully. So I don't want the maternal to be the name for that entire problematization. How do we think about hospitals? How do we think about healthcare? How do we think about shelter? How do we think about citizenship? All of those things are there. I accept that self-fragilization is an important strategy. If it is a strategy, it seems to me fragility comes upon us non-volitionally. I'm not sure it can ever be fully marshaled by a deliberate strategy. Perhaps it is a family, it shares a family resemblance with vulnerability. I think for her, self-fragilization becomes an important concept in a culture where military aggression and defensiveness becomes the norm, and that there's an anti-military ethos in this idea of self-fragilization that I respect. And it's true, it probably would not be my term, but it doesn't mean I don't relate to it. As to the refugee crisis, maybe briefly, I would simply say it's interesting to think about when and where refugees do in fact gather, and they are of course compelled to gather at borders that are closed. And in some cases, like Calais, there are minor polities that emerge in the camp, in the refugee camp. Who's going to represent the refugees? Who's going to decide strategy? Who's going to speak to the NGOs? Who's going to talk to the security guards? Who's going to try to stop the train? Who's going to try to get on the train? So there are informal assemblies. And there are some people who are doing work on that. But even as they pass through, I mean, passing through the Balkans, you made some really interesting points about thinking about the Balkans as a gateway to Europe. I'm sure that's right. It seems to me that as they pass, they enact rites of passage. And here I would just go back to a point I mentioned yesterday, which is that rights of mobility or capacity for mobility is prior to gathering. It's prior to assembly. Although people can assemble in motion too. So I think there are some ways that moving and acting together and even stitching together forms of support or enduring forms of abandonment are really crucial. I mean, I have followed some reports on the sharing of cell phones and bus schedules and transit routes. It's very interesting to think about the networks of support that take place over cell phones, which suggest that there are modes of acting, thinking, deliberating, and even offering support in the midst of highly precarious conditions. But I think there's much more that can be thought about in relationship to that important topic. Thank you.
So we continue. Thank you. Our next round will be Athena, and then we will hear Adriana and Vedran. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this roundtable and discuss this important book, which I think makes very important, very timely contributions to our understanding of the political implications and potentials of performativity without slipping into uncritical exuberance. I would like to raise 3 short points as lines of inquiry. First, having to do with the figure of the assembly. I think one of the most important contributions of this book is that it leads us to understand the assembly as a plural form of performative action in ways which differ from other understandings of pluralism. For example, in the context of liberal pluralism in general. So I would like to maybe hear more about that. How this plural form of performativity action differs from liberal pluralism, for example, especially in relation to a notion of the human, especially through the perspective of the human whose humanity persists in spite of the forces that seek to expropriate its humanness. I have in mind Achille Mbembe's work, especially his analysis of the spectre of the Negre. So is there such a thing as a spectral assembly or a spectral element which haunts the figure of the assembly? And then I would like to hear more about the very figure of the assembly. Not that I'm trying to strive for a definition here, but I wonder whether the assembly is, or it seeks to describe a provisional figure of struggle or an embodied form of radical democracy. Or maybe does it seek to describe and build maybe a post-party political formation that differs from or rejects even a politics of representation? And the reason that I'm asking that is that there's something quite ephemeral and fugitive, i.e. vulnerable to the assembly. And there are voices that want to make it maybe less ephemeral, less fugitive, and more durable. And I would like to hear whether you would endorse this impulse to durability. So I'm trying to raise an issue of social temporality in relation to the assembly. Second issue, popular sovereignty and the people. I appreciate the fact that the book asks who the people may be without answering, without closing off the question. And it asks what counts as public and how do people come together even when the conditions of their acting together have been devastated, as you put it. And this is a line that I really, really like. Butler writes, the people are produced by the conditions of possibility of their appearance. I think this is a wonderful formulation, and I take this opportunity to say how much I appreciate Butler's unconditional concern with the question of the condition of possibility. Now, regarding the people, I think there is another key term of the democratic lexicon, namely popular sovereignty, which comes up and maybe produce a certain kind of conundrum. I would perhaps challenge here to account for another sovereignty, for a sovereignty alternative to the state or the power of the elites, and I would like to hear how that would work in relation to your critique of sovereign notions of agency. And finally, agency, vulnerability, and the body. Last point. I think this book makes a very important contribution to the ways in which you try to extend the caliber or the purview of performativity beyond speech acts to include the concerted actions of the body. At the same time, you remind us that there is no way to talk about the body outside of a field of power. And I think the linchpin of your argument has to do with the way in which you make us able to think vulnerability and agency together. But what I found very thought-provoking, but at the same time I'm not sure if I can capture it very well, is a delicate distinction that you make between non-violent and passive resistance. And you mentioned that non-violent resistance does not say just no to the violent world, but crafts the self and its relation to the world. But then what about passive? I mean, why do you find it important to differentiate these two? Is there anything that you find important to be dismissed about passivity in this context? Thank you very much.
Again, borrowing from Eric's lectures from today, the link between an academic or a theorist and an activist, and I'm going to act now in that role, also in a state of emergence, depression, and resistance in a way, with my question and a comment, which leans specifically on the 5th chapter of this book, but it's also in conversation with the books Dispossession and Who Sings the Nation State, notably 2 books enacted in feminist dialogue. It's even more specifically related to one substantial claim, and I quote, freedom of assembly has to precede and exceed any form of government that confers or protects the right of assembly. Now, I want to contextualize this claim in one possible way, with one further claim. It's my wager that this book, which is not on feminism, is more feminist than any other before. And I wish to link feminism, which is in this book a very broad and I'd say purposefully indefinite designation, with what is being termed as popular sovereignty. So I'm here with Adina as well. Throughout the book, popular sovereignty is taken as something different than state sovereignty, sometimes contrary to it, sometimes it's preconditioned, sometimes it's the power to challenge or even topple it down. That freedom to assemble, to bodily enact popular sovereignty, what is called an anarchist internal or permanent revolution, seems to also embody feminist principles, if this is the right words at all. So now I'm thinking of feminism as a kind of split with the state, or as a perpetual act of separating from the state, especially when state acts as a facilitator in the expansion of the markets that transforms public entitlements into consumer goods and investment opportunities, B, as the producer of jettisoned lives, and C, as the instiller of fear through its military might, which forecloses the possibility of popular assembly, like in Paris. Rallying against life as unlivable, life as the human capital, jettisoned life, or enclosed life which is privatized by its internalization of fear, is deeply feminist. But it is also always skeptical towards the state, which acts as the provider of citizenship rights, differentially allocated and distributed, and provider of protection, which can be taken away or withdrawn. So, can politics, devoid of retrenchment in paternalism, which incorporates market paternalism and military paternalism, ever be realizable within a model of a nation-state? Can feminism ever be pro-state, or when, at what points, in what kind of state, if any, can we claim that we're dealing with a feminist-friendly or a feminist state?
So, thank you. I have to start with a twofold outing inspired by Judy Butler's book and lecture. Basically threefold, because I'm voiceless. Forgive me, this is the first outing, but you hear it. So the second one is I'm speaking as a frustrated citizen of Bosnia and Herzegovina, or to put it differently, frustrated citizen of former Yugoslavia. Frustrated with being in between, being on the periphery, and being irrelevant. So I will come back to it. So just about this first outing, but I see as a citizen of Bosnia and Herzegovina that we live in societies where forms of radical solidarity in opposition to political economic forces that are haunting us all the time are rather rare, and when showing up on the surface, suppressed either through direct or more frequently subtle repression. So what basically emerged in front of our eyes in the last 2 days, following Judy Butler's visit to Belgrade and the book and debates, is basically a kind of emerging of a new sense of the people, but in a very small room, in a hostile environment that is surrounding us. So just to put it precisely, we need not only this one book, but so many books, not only by you, by many, and we need to be a kind of a public assembly out of this small socialist, post-socialist rooms like we have it here. And the second outing is basically I'm a political scientist, and I'm probably the only one here, a kind of a strange body within the line of philosophers. And being a political scientist, I see this book as a deeply political book, and at the same time as a deeply feminist book, reading or following Adriana. So, following Adriana's argument, I will just a little bit explore the relation between feminism and state in the periphery, in this irrelevant periphery of the former Yugoslavia, and ask by the end only one utopian feminist question, and I hope that Judy is going to answer that one positively. So, the starting question for me is, how much is the newly emerging competitive and neoliberal or competitive authoritarianism that I see flourishing in the region built upon patriarchal negation and exclusion of the female and all other non-heterosexual identities? And I claim basically it is precisely this patriarchal negation and exclusion of the female, and it is by police and prison, because you are talking about police and prison, where all public assembly basically is haunted by police and by the prison. This is metaphorically in real politics the case here in the region. And it is only by police, prison, and by this patriarchal exclusion that societies in the Western Balkans or in former Yugoslavia or however you name it are kept stable. So, and by the way, stability is one of the key terms for the European Union for all those that want to democratize the peripheries. And by the way, the second term, this is also quite important because this is alluding to precarity, is pragmatism as a neoliberal term. We are called upon by international community, so-called international community, or by the European Union to be pragmatic, to behave pragmatically, to integrate, to do the homework. And this precisely calling to do the homework is drawing a new line between those that are pragmatic, that only few, and those that are excluded, put on the margin, which is then the new precariat, or the permanent transitionist precariat that we have here in the region. So, my argument is basically that this neoliberal authoritarianism, with patriarchal negation, exclusion of the female, build upon terms of stability and pragmatism as key terms of the new transitionist era, is preventing new forms of public assembly in the region and keeping the regimes alive. And the next point is basically the feminism, understood as Adriana just told us, is the key to understand and to attack these new regimes. And it is, I mean, the quote from your yesterday's lecture, to put Putin's words upside down, the feminist fight against the soul of man is basically the only one that can attack these regimes, both in ideological terms as well as in political terms. And it is precisely the place where we need your term of vulnerability. More precisely, your affirmative use of vulnerability and understood as, I'm quoting, a deliberate exposure to power as a part of the very meaning of political resistance as an embedded enactment. And here I connect this vulnerability to yet another important term from your yesterday's speech in the book, which is freedom. And I quote, freedom can only be exercised if there is enough support for the exercise of freedom, a material condition that enters into the act that it makes possible. And my questions to conclude are, the first one, the huge questions, how to exercise freedom in spaces and political entities on the periphery, marginalized, where freedom in this period of transition, permanent transition that has no end, has been reduced, stolen, and where material conditions for freedom are missing, and how to basically exercise freedom in conditions where freedom, discursively and in terms of realpolitik, was appropriated by ethno-nationalist entrepreneurs and by neoliberal ethno-nationalist entrepreneurs. So basically the question, and this is something that Wendy Brown is also posing, is how to reverse and renew meaning of freedom, how to reclaim democracy, freedom, and responsibility in the periphery, in the permanent transitionist periphery. And then the final question, this is following Adriana, can feminists rallying against life as unlivable be the way out for the region? Or to put it differently, I argue that only a moment where feminism becomes pro-state, Adriana, can be a momentum where freedom and responsibility will come back to the region on a broader scale in this particular room. And so, Judy, please just tell me that this is not a futile exercise in thinking of a full political scientist, but a kind of a real utopia.
So we are missing Randy.
No, I feel like I should pass this to Wendy, but she's not here, sadly. Wonderful. Many important issues raised. Well, first of all, thank you, Athena, for your brief but trenchant comments. It is true that plural action and plurality is not quite the same as pluralism, and how to think about differentiating those terms is important. I certainly read and engage the work of William Connolly on that topic, but perhaps I also move in a slightly different direction than he does. In your remarks, you suggest that perhaps something we might call humanity is understood as persisting even as the human has gone into crisis. And I think that that is an important question. I think I am also, though, reminded of the importance of resituating the human as a human animal or as a form of creaturely life among creatures, and that this is important in part as a way of understanding perhaps developing a different biopolitical vocabulary, one that does not disavow the animal in the human, the animal of the human, but also perhaps we need another name to think about the dignity, the persistence, the capacity that we associate with humanity. I'm not opposed to humanity. I would be wrong. I certainly defend the humanities in English. That's terribly important. But maybe humanity has its own specter. Maybe the animal is the specter of humanity. Or maybe none of us can have humanity without also being the animal. That would be good. So I appreciate the question of the specter. Seems like Derrida's in the room with us. What is this, the spectral assembly? I think that there are spectral assemblies in every assembly, and I'm rereading now Marx's 18th Brumaire as a way of trying to think about how the anachronistic reemerges in an animated form in the present. And of course, to even understand Syntagma, Gezi Park, Tahrir, I mean, these have enormous genealogies, which are, I would say, selectively animated in present-day assemblies, and maybe even the Assemblée Nationale in the Jeu de Paume is with us as well. I think that I do not reject the politics of representation. I do accept parliamentary democracy. I do think that all forms of parliamentary democracy depend, however, on what I would call popular sovereignty. But popular sovereignty is not distinct from the fugitive dimension of democracy. It supports and withdraws. It installs and destroys. When it no longer supports the parliamentary democracy that it elected, it can withdraw itself and delegitimate that government, even if that government responds to that delegitimation with military means, right? And responding with military means only intensifies that delegitimation. It doesn't mean the government comes down, it can't continue. And there are other forms of coercion that are non-military, which we might think about. But I actually think that what I mean by popular sovereignty has closer allegiances to an anarchist interim that is there in every parliamentary democratic form. I'm not saying we should be anarchists rather than parliamentary democrats, no. I'm saying there's an anarchist possibility, which is why so many democratic constitutions are so fearful of the mob, so fearful of the crowd, so fearful of the popular will, and it has to be constrained and checked. And in other words, there's a radical democratic potential that's always being managed by every parliamentary democracy. And I think that's a tension that I would want to preserve. I also think, and perhaps this is because I've been thinking about the Middle East and Israel and Palestine, that popular sovereignty can be divisible. The sovereign is not necessarily a unified figure or a master figure. It can be divisible, it can even be dispersed. I'm extremely interested in the idea of a kind of dispersed sovereignty. And it might be something other than pluralism. It might be a form of cohabiting in ways that acknowledge difference, but also claim a kind of cohabitation at the same time. I also think that it's very hard to defend the very important concept of political self-determination that we need for Greece, who should be able to decide how it pays its debts, right, or manage its own economic activity. For Palestine, which has not yet had or known the rights of political self-determination, for native peoples in Canada, US, and Mexico. Many indigenous movements rely very strongly on the concept of political self-determination, and I think that is linked with the idea of popular sovereignty, and I'm not sure we should, just because sovereignty has a bad name, when it's state sovereignty or when it's understood as the master subject, I'm not sure we should so quickly get rid of it altogether. Let's think about what it means or how it gets revised in those particular contexts. I am working on nonviolence now, and I suppose I'm working towards an idea of an aggressive nonviolent strategy. And maybe I'm wrong to, I don't need to disavow passive resistance, but I think that there is, there's a way of thinking nonviolence as agentic and as aggressive, even as it refuses violence. To think about an emphatic refusal of violence. And maybe I will make an argument about that in time. It is true that I want to claim that freedom of assembly precedes and exceeds any government. And maybe that is an anarchist notion, or maybe it's a popular democratic notion, maybe it's a populist view. I don't know. I do think that we would all do well to think about why Ernesto Laclau thought there could be a left populism. And maybe that would also be a question for Eric Fassin, given his own suggestion that maybe we can't really work with the idea of the people as such. I think Ernesto, before his death, was, well, he published a book on populism, on populist research, so has been trying to think about forms of left populism, what makes them left, how do they work. I love it that everybody thinks it's a feminist book. I don't have any problem with that. I think it might be a little bit of an anarchist book, I don't know. I think if it's feminist, it's also queer. I mean, it's feminist. Bernice Johnson Reagan has that beautiful passage on coalitions and the difficulty of staying in coalitions. And what a coalition is, especially a cross-racial feminist coalition, I rely on that enormously. But queer actions, perhaps even before Occupy, have been really very crucial to my understanding of alliance and mobilization. So if it's going to be feminist, it has to be queer, or feminist / queer, feminist / queer, radical democratic. I'll tell you, I think that that I also believe that there has to be a utopian horizon within which we think and act. I guess I have come to that conclusion. I didn't always think that, but I think experimenting with the possible is something we get to do in academic life, in universities, in art, in our creative and our theoretical work, and that it's a radical act when the very idea of another kind of future becomes impossible to consider. So opening up the horizon of the possible is not a bad idea. I mean, some horrible things can enter, like bad possibilities, but also some other kinds of things can, right? I mean, this is where our politics actually involves a kind of crafting. How do we think about principles that are crafted into forms of life, not prescriptive, but as kind of generative principles, as a matrix out of which a set of possibilities for life might be generated. I know that pragmatism has become a neoliberal term. I think Nancy Fraser tried to suggest that pragmatism could be used for both feminism and for socialism. So maybe we need to consider that. But I don't know if feminism is the way out. I don't think Butler can offer the way out. I was always worried that Serbia became an example in U.S. feminism when Catherine McKinnon claimed that she represented the women of Serbia. And I thought that was maybe a bad idea for her to say that. Wasn't it terrible? Was it Bosnia? It was in Bosnia. Okay, well, she may have confused that. But in any case, I think it's a really bad idea for U.S. intellectuals to go touring around the world telling people what the way out might be. No. If anything, I come here and listen to you, and I become a slightly more worldly, thoughtful person by virtue of your challenges and what you teach me. So sorry. But no, we really need to keep that in mind. The state is tricky. I mean, the problem with asking in the abstract, do we make use of the state, do we not? Is there a way to refigure the state on feminist principles? Certainly people have asked that, asked whether women leaders can do that. I'm not sure they can. I haven't seen that. But one problem is that what we call the state, when we ask that question, is already being dismantled through neoliberal policy. So which state are we seeking to be part of or not part of? I mean, the state is selling off its assets. At least that's what Wendy Brown would tell us. Maybe we need a radical and feminist critique of neoliberalism and its privatization strategies and its market rationality in order to usher in a different set of values that reminds us of what is the public good and what is the obligation to preserve the public good, which does include various kinds of services from which women and women benefit, which does include education, which does include healthcare and shelter. So I am not sure what to say there. I heard your frustration and your voice trying to speak, and I got the part about the periphery. Yes, we're in a small room in a hostile environment. But I think the Assemblée Nationale was in a small room in a hostile environment. A lot of things have started in small rooms in hostile environments. Sometimes you need the small room in order to be able to say certain things. Who knows what alliances might happen among the people here? We don't know. Anyway, thank you. All your difficult and important questions. I'm most grateful.
Well, Nicola, Bilena, and Yasmina, this is the order. I just didn't want to interrupt it when you start. Once you start, then I'm just fine.
Okay, after listening to your talk and reading your book, I will never say, my name is Nicola, but my parents named me Nicola. And I come from Rijeka, from the Department of Cultural Studies. And I'm really happy this session is coming to an end, because after listening each and every question, I kept rephrasing mine in order to know it will make some sense, because they're really good questions. And I really believe that lots of things we do, not only in social sciences and humanities, but also in quantum physics, are deeply biographical. As when we produce science, or we think we produce science. So my question is partially autobiographical, and it does have to do with the thing I emailed, but it's a little bit rephrased. So we have heard in the very beginning of our session that vulnerability can be seen as a framework for thinking our present political condition, and that's what you said. And it has been rephrased on several occasions. And it became especially acute due to the randomness of precarity. And this might be our reaction to the fact that after 9/11, we're facing some kind of deterritorialized war, a war without territories, and after Paris, after Madrid, after Beirut, after London, it's coming very, very close to us. And back in it became real, almost palpable. But Martin Luther King said back in the early 60s that an injustice here is a threat to justice everywhere, but we didn't listen to it very seriously. It was far, it was racial, it was also a product of a North-South divide. And I came as a student from Yugoslavia. I came to work on my PhD at UT Austin, and I was very vulnerable and very wounded by the war, and very actually helpless. I mean, I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what. There were not enough Serbs to fight, you know. There were not enough Croats to identify with them, and I escaped from the possibility of fighting, you know, what was, you know, my people, my country, my language. So I gathered with African-American students. When Jesse Jackson came to campus, he invited himself, so we didn't know even why. And really, in a conversation with some of the colleagues, they told me, well, you cannot understand the facets of our suffering because I'm quoting them, your forefathers, your ancestors were never lynched. Then, after taking classes with Rorty, I got tired of his insisting on binary oppositions. It was in '92, and I went to hear some talk in the classes taught by Eve Kosovsky-Sedgwick, and there I was told by a group of students that as a heterosexual, I cannot really understand them. I cannot identify with some things. So. Then I was invited by the Muslim Student Association to do the talk, and the title was Holocaust in Bosnia. And then for some reason, Elie Wiesel freaked out, saying, you know, you cannot use that word. It happened only to the Jews. And I mean, I know, you know, not other extermination had a pseudo-scientific blueprint for executing it, but it's very dangerous to claim the exclusive copyright to tragedy. We were using it hoping that, you know, the power of the word might prevent the reoccurrence of the very event of a genocide in, let's say Bosnia. So actually what, and in your book, you are calling for solidarity on many levels. And when writing on bodies in their dependency on other bodies and networks of support, refusing to conceive of individual bodies as completely distinct from one another. So, like with all this, and I very much liked what I read, and I think nobody here mentioned one facet of your book. I really love your style, your writing style, and if I go back to what happened to me as a graduate student and as a politician activist, I mean, what was the chance, if any, I will call them provisionally, of special interest groups, like not to change or even to understand the world or anything prior to trying to make a livable life from a bad one or rather undignified one to a good one. What is the power of a special interest group?
Sorry, hello. I have a problem with my arm, that's why I need a kind of support. It's very nice support from my friend here. So, what I would like to say, I know that we are almost all tired right now, and that actually we all together perform kind of multi-locality. But at this time, first of all, I would like to say it was really kind of exciting theoretical experience to read this book, especially to read certain parts of this book. And I'm very thrilled to share some, actually to be here to share ideas and comments around it. But being aware of the limited time, I will address only one issue that actually tackles my eye. And this is the issue of public as political subjectivity, referring to the sometime we already heard this morning so many times, but it was different kind of sometime. From the book, we are still the people. So the accent is on this still. And of course it is accompanied by the more general one, we are the people. I follow actually the line of Professor Butler's thought from the book that we are still the people means, so I quote, therefore still persisting and not yet destroyed. But this is my first question, and the kind of what I would like to share with you, it's a kind of my human anxiety all the time when I'm thinking about it, is how to act when destruction of humans or destruction of every single aspect of being human right now is already at stake. So how then? How can we act then? So what I found to be most significant at the first glance is that it invokes the possibility of enabling and creating a human zone at paradoxically the very age of human zone itself. Of course, through public performative gesture, and despite ethical disputes around human subjectivity, political agency, and also popular sovereignty. Here, what I'm asking myself also, and also asking all of us here, whether the possibility of human assembly in reminding us of what still the people is means an ultimate condition of acting as being, or rather kind of transformative compassion among humans through modes of social reciprocity and recognition, and of course solidarity above all, if I refer also to Laurent Berlin. So, yet exercising a close reading, this so-called phrase, we are still the people, apart from a power of public enunciation, signifies a human abyss, since an effort for equalizing position, so that is the point of condition, pulsates all the time, and it is, from my point of view, somehow unbridgeable. I think a major part of the problem is how to address a subjugated perspective, either precarious or subaltern, or furthermore a social death or bare life perspective when claiming for political agency, without undoing material causes of social inequality, of human inequality and humiliation itself. That's why I wonder, especially nowadays, even more, when we are faced with political and economic racism and new types of geopolitical war imperialism and terror acts, whether the contested we, as very fragile, already very fragile, temporary and arbitrary, and non-foundational, as Athena yesterday said, becomes a concept, so becomes abyss itself, far from the potency of any kind of political subjectivity. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I have to say that I greatly enjoyed translating Judith Butler's book Undoing Gender about 10 years ago, published in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was, but much has happened since, and I'm particularly happy that your latest book is on performative assembly as such, because my own intervention is coming from the experiences of academic activist and artistic work in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where traumatic common corporeal injuries and predicaments have been normalized a long time ago, for more than 2 decades, and basically the governance, ethno-nationalist neoliberal governance of affect and object in Bosnia and Herzegovina can be seen as basically human waste, governed through terror as usual, through normalized terror. And I'm also interested in discussing some of the things that I think are very important based on my own experience of protests and plenums in Bosnia, because I was involved very much so both in political strategies and infrastructural things that we had to do in Tuzla plenum and protests that later on spread throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I was particularly pleased with your insistence on how do we produce the actual infrastructural conditions for politics and for political expression. And this, in this sense, I think that exactly the material experiences of precarious subjectivities caught in multiple complex emergencies affecting our lives, labor and thought today must be a matter of political enterprise and we might term it fieldwork in philosophy. But without this political enterprise on the ground and without this creative work in the horizon of hope, solidarity and social change, we can't really pretend to be reflecting on emergency-induced hysterias, numbness or acceptance, or really be authentic in speaking against resentment, envy, melancholia, nostalgia, despair as predominant effective mechanisms of this culturalized neoliberal governance. So just to say a few words that plenums in Bosnia and Herzegovina did not come about out of nowhere, but actually came very much from this nexus of practices, emancipatory movements and practices in the field of social activism, knowledge production, critical pedagogies and art, that have been questioning the merging of ethno-corporate and neoliberal regimes of power and violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, very much so through their specific post-atrocity order of governance and their colonization of the whole spheres of public and everyday life. So basically culture of terror, trauma and exception that we have witnessed in transitional industry, transitional justice industry as a whole have also been very much about exposing political and economic orders where all life feeds into ethnicity incorporated. And from this perspective, it was, and also from what has happened on after the plenums and protests, I would like us to perhaps think about new modes of struggle against inequality and reclaim some of the tools we need in this sense. So I very much agreed with your claim, I very much liked the part in the book where you say that claims of identification with someone's predicament are not equal to solidarity, to politically productive solidarity. And I think we should move forward in the state of emergency for trying to generalize or universalize cultural identifications. It is not only about cultural identifications that we need
to universalize, but truly speak openly about class antagonisms we need to take on, and including the sphere of knowledge production, which is not exempt from class antagonisms inside of them. And I think that when we start talking about the field of knowledge production, we also might actually avoid this dichotomy between intellectuals and activists, because knowledge production is the field where many actors can come together, and all of that can also result in something as promising as performative public assemblies and street protests, etc. So basically, the category of the human or living, is impossible to think without taking on this class antagonism, and also political economies around it, like colonial political economies, that, and also all the effective mechanisms indispensable from them. So my questions are actually going in the direction of this violence, non-violence problem that you have been reflecting, as many others, especially referring to Benjamin's critique of violence, and also something about this paradox or crevice between fear and hope. And what I'm afraid, I think it's very realistic that we will not be having that many public assemblies or performative assemblies in the future because of the backlash of the elites when it comes to civilian protests. And I think that it's going to get even worse. But what I notice in much of left and liberal scholarship, both radical left and radical liberal, and activism, is a saturation with a series of platitudes that don't our capacities to think and act politically. So instead of thinking of actually how do we as intellectuals / activists or actors actually in knowledge production, how do we inhabit the ground, how do we ourselves produce this public space we are talking about, I think we withdraw into a peculiar sort of solipsism of passion, or passionate subjectivity and body collectively. So I think that we have to think about how personally and collectively we embody the symptoms of alienation, all the affects due to either defeat or depression or faint-heartedness, etc. So maybe it's all too much, but maybe a radical political slogan or gesture for today that we should wish on ourselves too much of everything, because only when things get unbearable, the only reason for continuing to live is this radical hope that tomorrow might be different. So, to cut to my two questions is how to position ourselves towards violence in the context of bodies in public space, navigating this paradox of fear and hope, especially if considering the fact that I think that it's exactly this crevice between fear and hope that we find very difficult to think and act upon. And the second question is, what sort of affective fiber is necessary to take on productively those political strategies that blur the distinction violence, non-violence?
Thank you, Yasmina. So Judith will respond to these comments and questions, and we will have time, as I'm so happy that we are going smoothly towards the end of this seminar. We will have time for questions from the floor, but only for 3 questions, so that you've been aware of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's, again, so many important points here, and I just want to thank you for elaborating your questions in the ways that you have. I guess the situation in the U.S. Academy in which claims of identity are put forward is a very difficult one, and I think it does sometimes produce a kind of ethnographic shock on the part of those who travel to U.S. Campuses and see how the logic of political identity gets reproduced in ways that are quite antagonistic and that produce rupture time and again. I think that's right. I don't know if I would call them special interests. I think that's a term that the Republican Party uses in order to talk about women. So I mean, we have to be. I mean, it's half the population is a special interest. It's not the general will, right? So they make a distinction between who's a special interest and what's the general public. Anybody who's marked by gender or race is a special interest. But still, there's a really good question here, how to deal with that marking and how does it emerge in political discourse. Maybe we could skip forward and remember that absolute identification with another, that is to say, being able to completely and utterly take the place of another in whatever it is they have suffered or in whatever it is they struggle for, is not a possibility, and it's certainly not the basis of solidarity. It cannot be. And I think, for instance, comparative genocide studies has done some really important work about exactly what can be said between that establishes comparative possibilities, not what's worse and what's better, right? But how do we establish a dialogue on atrocity? How do we establish a dialogue on mass death? How do we establish a dialogue on the technologies of state-sponsored murder? Like all of those questions are really important ones to think about in common, even though many of us come to those issues from very, very different historical circumstances. And I think that there are better ways of doing that, but something like that strikes me as closer to the model of solidarity that I'm interested in. I do think that we are still the people, as a claim, does say we, whoever we is who is standing there, so there's this deictic moment where there's a pointing to those of us who are living and assembled, whoever we happen to be, we have not yet been eradicated. It does not mean that others have not been eradicated. Indeed, the reason we can say we are still the people is that we know very well that others are no longer the people, or they are dead, or they are dying, or they are at risk of death. And I think that there's a very important relationship between memorialization and assembly that we haven't really talked about. But I do think that asserting the grievability of lives that have been lost and marking them, and not necessarily through monumental forms of mourning, but by practices of public acknowledgement that become reiterated throughout public space and time, that is a crucial feature of many public assemblies. Indeed, in Palestine, it is sometimes difficult to know what is a funeral and what is a protest. And I think that happens in many places. I know that Assad used to, perhaps still does, shoot at groups of people who would collect to mourn, fearing the uprising potential of those who collect to mourn. So I think the question of grievability and marking grievability is one way to transform the idea of humans as human waste into valuable life, or or grievable life. Livable life is still the aspiration of the living. Grievable life is the entitlement of the dead, or of those who are on their way toward death. I think we are still the people marks the fact that we could be destroyed. Some of us have been destroyed, and in the face of that potential destruction, we are still here assembling, but also exposing ourselves in the way that every assembly does to possible force or even destruction. I mean, I am very interested in this question of the normalization of trauma and what happens under regimes that understand themselves as post-atrocity, or that have normalized unspeakable losses, or even capitalized on their unspeakability. And I'm interested to hear that there are a number of different practices, including art practices and critical pedagogy, that are part of the knowledge production that seeks to interrupt and call to question the post-atrocity order of governance. That seems crucial. And I think there's also a way of bringing that forward, and I visited the Centro Conti in Buenos Aires, where they, of course, have given a lot of thought to memorializing those who were disappeared, tortured, or explicitly killed. And I think that they make a distinction between sensationalist representations and those that actually work with a pedagogical aim, and which also allow for a spatial organization of memory such that one can pass in and out and have time for reflection, rather than to be simply overwhelmed or asked to relive a traumatic effect. And I think that particular idea that was popular, at least in some Holocaust museums, that one had to relive the traumatic effect, has been rethought by a number of people, and I'm interested in both critical memory studies in that respect, but also I think that there are comparative and transnational projects that are dealing with that in ways that are, I believe, really, really important. I also agree that fiscal elites and their state allies are very interested in suppressing civilian protest. It did strike me as quite horrible that the French government, in establishing a state of emergency, not only suspended the freedom of assembly right away, but identified the climate change conference as one in relationship to which there shall be no demonstration, right? So very tactical, very political use of the state of emergency to quell civilian protests. I wonder, I just maybe have this last thing to say, and then am I done? Okay, the very last thing I have to say about depression and melancholy and hopelessness. One of the features of neoliberalism that I like least is the idea that we are each responsible for the suffering that we undergo, and I think it does feed into a classically melancholic and depressive position in which one imagines oneself to be the sole source of one's own suffering. One didn't try hard enough. One didn't put oneself on the market often enough. One didn't prepare for the market. One didn't work harder on the job or show one's capacities or whatever it might be. One didn't sell oneself well enough. But I do think that sometimes when we enter into situations of complete pessimism from which we can find no exit, it may be because we've let our suffering become too private, that we've allowed the suffering to become too individual, that we've failed to identify the common elements and even the structural conditions that reproduce us in our isolated suffering. So moving out of that isolation, I do believe, I mean, it may just be commiseration, but it may be something more. It may be something more. It might articulate a different kind of sociality that may well remind us of the limits of individualism. I don't know.